Our country has never had a former president convicted of a crime. There are now a lot of questions about what this could mean for his future.
So joining us now is Tony Smith, professor of political science and law for UC Irvine. And Professor Smith, thank you so much for joining us. Just right off the bat, were you surprised, like we were, that this jury came back so quickly?
I wasn't. I practiced law for about 20 years before I went into academics. And when a prosecution team does a good job of laying out the story about why the defendant should be convicted, it usually doesn't take long for the jury to come back. And in essence, this is really not a complicated case. It might seem complicated if you're just kind of casually looking at it, but really it's not. And the defense, they had kind of a challenging time because the defense strategy they decided on is he didn't have sex with Stormy Daniels, but if he did, he didn't pay her, Michael Cohen did, out of generosity or something. And even if you don't believe that, you can't believe Michael Cohen because he's this sewer rat that's just out for himself. So the defense took a story that doesn't make any sense. They wanted to vilify Michael Cohen, but also say it was his decision to pay Stormy Daniels. So the better defense would have been, hey, I was just doing what my lawyers told me. I had no idea that this was anything wrong, and it's really their fault, not me. I just did what I was told. But that's not really in Donald Trump's character to admit that he didn't know something or he wasn't in charge of anything or something like that. So I wasn't surprised by how fast it came back. I also was not surprised that it was unanimous on all 34 counts. When Trump sympathetic legal analysts last week were starting to say things like, well, excuse me, there's one juror that's kind of looks Trump friendly. He's smiling. The juror is smiling at Trump guests in the courtroom, and we're hoping maybe for a hung jury. That lets you know that the defense didn't think they were going to get an acquittal either.
Well, Professor Smith, I think that this is obviously a lot of food for thought, knowing that you now do teach law. As you look at this, and this is the takeaway from this, what are you going to say about the prosecutors? Because obviously the prosecutors and the defense going, head to head, good attorneys on both sides.
In fact, the defense really did. I mean, I think they did about as good a job as they could. They did a few kind of weird things that you can attribute to their client, probably, like in the closing argument, the conversation about what the penalty might be. He knew that was wrong. He knew he shouldn't have done it. And what he was trying to do was spark an overreaction from the judge so that they would have appeal fodder. But the judge has done a really good job of managing the case, even under the difficult circumstances of the Trump show. So I kind of think this is a textbook how to run a good prosecution, and a textbook what do you do with a difficult client, and a kind of a weak roster of defense strategies.
What's looming now, obviously, is the penalty. What do you foresee happening here?
Well, Trump's probably going to get a worse penalty than he would have had he not constantly violated the gag order. If you're being sentenced in federal court, there's pretty rigid guidelines, and the judge, him or herself, really doesn't have that much discretion without extraordinary circumstances. But in the New York State court, the judge has a lot of discretion. So, excuse me, he could go anywhere from probation to home confinement to some sort of prison term, as well as fines. So what I would expect is probably the statutory maximum fine, and then probably a probationary period of something like 3 or 4 years, where if Trump doesn't commit any other new felonies, then that's the end of it. But I don't think he'll be sentenced to prison, primarily because of his advanced age. Very seldom will a defendant in his late 70s in his or her late 70s, get sentenced to jail. Part of the reason is practical. It becomes very expensive if you've got a bunch of people in their late 70s and 80s in prison, you've got a much more expensive healthcare proposition than if you're putting people in their 20s and 30s in jail. So that's what I think would happen.
Do you think then the judge would consider the fact that he is a presidential candidate or a likely presidential candidate in his sentencing, or is that not part of the consideration?
I don't think that's part of the consideration. I think the judge is going to do everything he can to not really have that be the decision. And it's easy enough. You just say, well, what would I do if you weren't running for president? And it really shouldn't impact it. What you aspire to do in your future life ought not to be the thing that dictates the criminal penalty for your bad behavior. So if you wanted to be an astronaut or a doctor and wanted to go to med school, the judge would be acting improperly if he took those things into consideration. So the idea that he wants to be president again really ought not to affect the sentencing for the crime. If anything, it would be an exacerbating situation because he committed the crime the first time trying to be president.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. A historic day. We certainly appreciate your insight. Again, Tony Smith, professor of political science at UC Irvine.
And stay with
Thank you
us.
both.
You bet. Great to talk to you again.